The Unfiltered Human on the Fringe special episode, The Body Remembers, Nervous System, Trauma and Healing. Welcome back to The Unfiltered Human on the Fringe. This episode takes us deep into the body, into the nervous system, where trauma writes its longest stories. Fear, anxiety, hypervigilance, and disconnection don't just come from thoughts. They come from patterns wired into our biology. Trauma reshapes our nervous system, pulling us into survival states that can quietly dictate how we live, how we love, and how we lose ourselves. We'll explore how unresolved experiences affect relationships, why PTSD and CPTSD alter the way we feel safe, how polarity and attraction often lead us back into destructive dynamics, and what it takes to build practices of safety and recovery. Because trauma doesn't just haunt memory, it inhabits the body. And until we learn to listen to that body, healing remains incomplete. The science of survival. Before we can talk about trauma, we need to talk about the body's survival system. The nervous system is constantly scanning for threat or safety, long before our conscious minds catch up. The nervous system is map. When unresolved trauma is present, that system can get stuck, interpreting everyday life through the lens of danger. Attributes of nervous system states: fight, anger, control, aggression; flight, anxiety, restlessness, hyperactivity; freeze, shutdown, numbness, paralysis; fawn, appeasement, people-pleasing, self-abandonment; safety and social connection, calm, openness, trust. Themes: how trauma shapes survival neuroception. Stephen Porges' polyvagal theory shows that our bodies constantly scan the environment for cues of safety or danger without conscious awareness. Hypervigilance, unresolved trauma keeps the system on, leaving us in constant anxiety or alertness. Chronic stress, long-term activation of survival states can lead to illness, exhaustion, and emotional burnout. Loss of play and intimacy, when the nervous system can't settle into safety, joy and connection are compromised. Personal reflection. I can trace my relationship with the nervous system back to childhood, even before I had the language for it. Growing up, the household atmosphere was often unpredictable. The smallest shift in tone, the sharp sound of footsteps, or a slammed door could send my body into hypervigilance. At the time, I didn't see it as trauma, it was just life. But looking back, I can see my nervous system was already adapting, always scanning, always braced, always ready to react. Later, as I got older, that wiring carried over into my adult life. There were times when I would walk into social settings and immediately feel unsafe, even when nothing was wrong. My heart would race, my chest would tighten, and I would either retreat into silence or overcompensate with performance, trying to manage everyone else's emotions so that I wouldn't feel threatened. What I thought of as anxiety was really my nervous system replaying an old survival script. The toll showed up physically too. Periods of migraines that left me bedridden. The diabetes diagnosis forced me to confront how stress and lifestyle had been eroding me silently. Even moments of collapse where I would fall asleep suddenly and heavily in the middle of the day, as though my body had decided it had no more to give. And then there were relationships. I can see now how often I was drawn into unhealthy dynamics because of this wiring. Hypervigilance made me mistake intensity for intimacy, volatility for aliveness. Sometimes I would choose partners who were unavailable or unstable because part of me was unconsciously familiar with that instability. It felt like home. I confused the nervous system's alarm bells for attraction. One of the biggest shocks was realizing that even when I was in safe environments, my body didn't believe it. My mind would say, "You're fine," but my body would be coiled like a spring, waiting for something to go wrong. That mismatch created an inattention that shaped not just how I related to others, but how I related to myself. It left me feeling fractured, a mind that wanted peace, a body that was stuck in war. Psychological insight, polyvagal theory, and trauma. Stephen Porges' polyvagal theory gives us a language for this. The nervous system has three primary states: the ventral vagal, safety and social connection; the sympathetic, fight or flight; and the dorsal vagal, shutdown, collapse. Trauma keeps people stuck in the sympathetic and dorsal states, often oscillating between hyperarousal and numbness. What's crucial is neuroception, the body's unconscious detection of safety or danger. Trauma survivors often misread neutral or even kind cues as threatening, because the system has been conditioned to expect harm. This is why a partner's silence might feel like abandonment, or a minor conflict might feel like a life or death rupture. Neuroscience backs this up. Trauma increases amygdala activity, fear and threat perception, while dampening prefrontal regulation, reasoning, logic. PTSD studies show this imbalance vividly. Trauma survivors literally perceive danger more acutely, even when it isn't there. CPTSD, built from prolonged exposure to instability, doesn't just create moments of fear, it shapes personality structures, self-image, and attachment. I've seen these truths in my own life. When I was struck with migraines or collapsing from exhaustion, I thought my body was betraying me. In reality, it was carrying decades of survival stress. When I ended up in unhealthy relationships, I thought I was just unlucky in love. In reality, my nervous system was steering me unconsciously toward familiar danger because familiarity felt safer than the unknown. Even my experiences of attraction were shaped by these survival patterns. Polarity, the pull towards someone different or opposite, wasn't always about chemistry. Sometimes it was about trauma, two nervous systems unconsciously locking into each other's wounds. It took years of reflection, therapy, and research to understand that what I thought was choice was often adaptation. But there is hope. Research into neuroplasticity shows that the nervous system can rewire. Practices like mindfulness, breathwork, safe relationships, and somatic therapy can gradually teach the body to trust again, to return to safety, to experience intimacy without collapse. Healing isn't about erasing the past, it's about teaching the nervous system that the past is over. Embodiment prompt or practice this week. Notice your body in moments of stress. Ask, am I in fight, flight, freeze, or fawn? Then, gently breathe into your belly for 2-3 minutes. Place a hand on your chest. Whisper, I'm safe now. Even if your mind doubts it, give your body the message it longs for. Integration moment understanding trauma begins with understanding the nervous system. Survival states aren't signs of weakness, they're signs of adaptation. The first step toward healing is awareness, naming the state, noticing the pattern, and recognizing that it belongs to the body's history, not necessarily to the present. Seed to plant each time you notice yourself tense or on edge this week. Pause. Instead of asking, what's wrong with me? Ask, what state is my body in? That question alone can shift shame into awareness. Trauma and relationships trauma doesn't just live inside us. It plays out between us. The nervous system that learns survival in childhood often reenacts those same dynamics in adulthood. When attraction becomes a wound, what feels like chemistry may in fact be familiarity. What looks like an attraction may really be trauma meeting trauma. Relationships, whether romantic, familial, or even within groups, often become mirrors of our nervous system states. Fight, flight, freeze, and fawn don't just describe individual patterns. They play out in the dance between people, shaping intimacy, conflict, and even collective behavior. Attributes of trauma in relationships: polarity, attraction drawn to opposites that echo old wounds; projection, seeing the past in the present partner or group; repetition, cycles of abandonment, control, or chaos replayed; collapse, nervous systems shutting down intimacy when triggered; repair, possibility of healing through awareness and safe connection. Themes: polarity and destructive attraction, the pull of familiar pain. Trauma often draws us toward what we know, not what we need. Intensity as aliveness. Chaos can be mistaken for chemistry, volatility for passion. Fawn and control. One partner appeases, the other dominates. Both feel trapped. Healing through awareness. Recognizing the nervous system's role can interrupt destructive patterns. Personal reflection. I can see these patterns clearly when I look back at my own relationships. There were times when I was pulled toward intensity, convinced it was attraction. The volatility, the emotional highs and lows, the sense that something could erupt at any moment, it felt alive. But really, it was my nervous system replaying old scripts, mistaking chaos for connection. At times, I found myself in the fawn role, bending myself to keep the peace, silencing my own needs so the relationship wouldn't collapse. Other times, I caught myself slipping into control, trying to shape the other person's emotions so I wouldn't feel my own insecurity. Neither pattern was authentic intimacy. Both were survival strategies. and then there were moments of collapse. A simple disagreement could leave me feeling as though the whole relationship was crumbling, even when the other person wasn't abandoning me. My body didn't know how to tell the difference between a minor rupture and a life or death threat. That tension didn't just affect romance. It shaped friendships, work dynamics, and even how I approached groups. It's taken me years to see that what I thought was choice was often unconscious wiring. I wasn't broken, but my nervous system was repeating what it had learned long ago. Psychological insight, trauma bonds, and attachment psychologists call these dynamics trauma bonds, cycles where love and harm intertwine. Patrick Carnes describes them as attachments formed through a mix of intensity, manipulation, and unresolved wounds. Attachment theory also sheds light here. Anxious, preoccupied attachment often manifests as hypervigilance in relationships, while avoidant attachment reflects withdrawal or control to avoid vulnerability. Disorganized attachment, often linked to childhood trauma, can oscillate between both extremes, desperate closeness, and sudden retreat. Neuroscience confirms this. The amygdala, threat center of the brain, becomes hyperactive in trauma survivors, leading to heightened reactivity in conflict. At the same time, the prefrontal cortex, responsible for regulation and perspective, often underfunctions. This means that arguments feel like threats, and ordinary disagreements can trigger fight, flight, or freeze responses disproportionate to the moment. Embodiment prompt or practice. This week, notice when you feel chemistry or tension with another person. Pause and ask, is this attraction grounded in safety, or is it intensity born of old wounds? Am I acting from my present self or my survival self? Write down one relationship where you've noticed this pattern. Integration moment trauma reshapes how we connect. It makes chaos feel alive, silence feel like danger, and conflict feel like collapse. But once we learn to map our nervous system states, relationships shift. We stop mistaking intensity for intimacy. We stop chasing familiarity as though it were fate. Healing doesn't mean never being triggered. It means recognizing the trigger for what it is and choosing differently. Scenario and analysis from couples to crowds. These dynamics don't just play out between lovers, they scale. Individual example, the pursuit of intensity. A couple argues constantly, breaking up and reconciling in cycles. To outsiders, it looks toxic, but to them, it feels magnetic. Psychology shows this is a trauma bond. The nervous system interprets volatility as intimacy. Studies of attachment insecurity confirm that unpredictability in relationships often reinforces, rather than weakens, emotional dependence. Group example: the Stanford Prison Experiment in 1971. Philip Zimbardo's infamous study placed ordinary students into roles of guards and prisoners. Within days, guards abused authority and prisoners collapsed into submission. What began as role play escalated into cruelty. The study revealed how quickly nervous system states can scale in groups: fight and control in the guards, freeze and fawn in the prisoners. Trauma patterns are not only personal, they are collective, erupting wherever power is uncontained. Cultural example: online mobs' digital outrage works the same way. Social media amplifies anger, shame, and reactivity until individuals feel justified in attacking strangers. Research into de-individuation, Festinger 1952, shows that anonymity lowers inhibition, unleashing impulses normally constrained by social norms. Trauma states become crowd states, fight turns into attack, fawn into compliance, freeze into silence. These scenarios remind us that trauma is not just private suffering. It is relational and systemic. Without awareness, our survival wiring will shape not only who we love, but how societies function. Seed to plant this week: when you feel pulled into intensity in love, in conflict, or even in group settings, pause. Ask yourself, is this attraction to safety or addiction to familiarity? That question alone can begin to unhook trauma from a relationship. The body remembers. Trauma in intimacy trauma doesn't just live in the mind, it lodges in the body. Long after the event has passed, the nervous system holds the memory. A partner's raised voice, a sudden silence, even a glance can set off responses that feel overwhelming and irrational. Intimacy becomes a stage where old wounds reappear, not because we choose it, but because our body remembers. When the body tells the story, when trauma is unresolved, touch can trigger, closeness can suffocate, and vulnerability can feel like danger. Intimacy, instead of being a sanctuary, becomes a battlefield between what we long for and what we fear. Attributes of trauma in intimacy: hypervigilance, scanning for danger even in moments of safety; numbness, shutting down emotions or physical sensations to avoid pain; flashback, past intruding into present, triggered by minor cues; ambivalence, longing for closeness but fearing collapse; embodied memory, the nervous system knows even when the mind forgets. Themes: intimacy as a mirror of survival, sexuality, and safety. Unresolved trauma can make physical closeness overwhelming, leading to avoidance, dissociation, or compulsivity. Conflict as reenactment, arguments replay parental fights or childhood chaos. Love and fear entwined, the body wants connection, but the nervous system prepares for abandonment or betrayal. Healing through the body, somatic practices, breathwork, grounding, polyvagal therapy reconnect us with safety in the present. Personal reflection, looking back, I can see how many times intimacy felt like both hunger and fear at once. In some relationships, I wanted closeness, but found myself pulling away as soon as I felt too exposed. Other times, I clung harder, convinced that any silence meant rejection. My nervous system was always scanning. A change in tone, a look that seemed distant, even if nothing was wrong, my body reacted as though abandonment was already happening. I didn't always recognize it then, but now I see it clearly. I was reliving old survival states. There were also moments of shame, times when I couldn't relax into physical intimacy, or when my emotions felt too volatile to share. On the surface, it looked like I was in the present, but underneath, my body was carrying echoes of the past. Those echoes didn't just affect me, they affected my partners, creating cycles of distance, confusion, and hurt. Only later, through learning about trauma and the nervous system, did I begin to realize that my body wasn't betraying me. It was protecting me, but in ways that no longer served my life. Psychological insight, somatic memory, and attachment. Bessel van der Kolk, in The Body Keeps the Score, describes how trauma imprints itself on the nervous system. Even when the conscious mind forgets, the body responds through muscle tension, heart rate, gut reactions. Trauma is not only a story we remember, but one we embody. Attachment research shows how this plays out in intimacy. People with histories of trauma often show disorganized attachment, where the partner is both desired and feared. Neuroimaging studies reveal that trauma survivors often have heightened amygdala activity, threat detection, and reduced prefrontal cortex regulation, reasoning, perspective. This means intimacy is often processed as danger rather than safety. Somatic psychology emphasizes that healing must include the body. Techniques such as grounding, breathing, and body-based therapies help retrain the nervous system to experience connection without triggering collapse. Embodiment prompt or practice this week. Notice how your body reacts in moments of closeness. Does your breath shorten? Do your muscles tense? Do you lean in or do you pull back? Without judging, simply name what your body is doing. Write down one moment where your body spoke before your mind did. Integration moment. The body remembers what the mind forgets. This can feel like betrayal, but it can also be a doorway. When we learn to listen to our body without shame, we begin to see that our reactions are not failures. They are old forms of protection, and protection, once recognized, can be softened into presence. Scenarios and analysis, intimacy and collective memory. Individual example. Touch as trigger. A trauma survivor flinches when their partner reaches out suddenly. The partner feels rejected, but in reality, the body is remembering earlier harm. Research in trauma therapy, Levine, 1997, shows how sensory cues bypass thought and go straight to survival responses. Without awareness, both partners misinterpret the moment. One feels unsafe, the other feels unwanted. Group example: the recovered memory debate. In the 1980s and 1990s, waves of people began reporting traumatic memories surfacing during therapy. Some were validated, others were later challenged as false memories. The controversy reveals how powerful and sometimes unreliable embodied memory can be. Trauma lives in the body, but translating that into narrative truth is complex. For groups and courts, This raised difficult questions. When the body remembers what the mind doubts, whose reality is recognized? Historical example: Holocaust survivors and generational trauma studies of Holocaust survivors show heightened rates of PTSD symptoms decades later, not only in the survivors but in their children. Researchers, Yehuda, 2014, found biological markers, changes in stress hormones passed across generations. Trauma, embodied in one generation, became intimacy and anxiety issues in the next. This demonstrates that trauma in intimacy is not just personal, but historical, shaping how families love, fear, and connect. Seed to plant this week: when your body reacts in intimacy, tensing, pulling away, freezing, instead of judging it, whisper, "I see you. I know you're protecting me." That small act of compassion begins the slow work of teaching the body that safety is possible, even here, even now. Fear, anxiety, and security. The nervous system in daily life fear is not always dramatic. Most of the time it whispers, a rush of anxiety before speaking up at work, a tightening of the chest when your partner seems distant, the silent dread when you see a certain number calling your phone. The everyday nervous system. The nervous system evolved to keep us alive, but in modern life, it often misreads signals. We live in a world of deadlines, notifications, and constant stimulation, yet the body reacts as though we are still in the jungle. Stress becomes chronic, and safety feels elusive. To understand ourselves and our relationships, we need to see how fear and anxiety are not just in the head. They are physiological, lived in breath, heart rate, posture, and presence. Attributes of nervous system responses: hyperarousal, fight or flight, racing heart, restless energy. Hyperarousal, freeze, shutdown, numbness. Anxiety, chronic anticipation of threat, even when none is present. Safety seeking, scanning for cues of connection or protection. Primitive memory, unconscious reactions shaped by early attachment and trauma. Themes: security and survival, in daily life fear misapplied. The same system that once saved us from predators now triggers during emails or arguments. Anxiety as anticipation, constantly preparing for rejection, failure, or loss drains presence and intimacy. Safety cues, small signals, tone of voice, body language shape whether we feel safe or unsafe with others. Relationships as regulators, partners, friends, and groups act as extensions of the nervous system, calming or escalating us depending on their presence. Personal reflection. For much of my life, I didn't realize how much my body was driving me. There were moments where anxiety seemed to take over completely, heart racing, chest tight, mind fogged. Sometimes it was small things: a tense meeting at work, an unresolved argument at home. Other times it was deeper: the fear of abandonment, the dread of being humiliated. I've noticed how relationships in particular exposed this. If I felt ignored or dismissed, my nervous system reacted long before my rational mind could. I'd either overreact, getting sharp, defensive, pushing too hard, or I'd shut down, withdrawing into silence. Looking back, I see that I wasn't choosing those reactions consciously. My body was deciding for me. And yet, when I started learning about the nervous system, something shifted. I began to see that anxiety wasn't weakness or flaw. It was my body trying to protect me. Naming the state, fight, flight, freeze, fawn, gave me a little distance. I could start to breathe again instead of spiraling. That simple awareness gave me a sense of choice I hadn't had before. Psychological insight, polyvagal theory, and felt safety. Stephen Porges' polyvagal theory explains why we respond differently to stress. The vagus nerve regulates whether we feel safe, threatened, or overwhelmed. When safe, we access social engagement. We connect, play, create. When threatened, we go into fight or flight. When danger feels overwhelming, we collapse into freeze. Anxiety often arises when the system can't find safety cues. Even if no threat exists, the body stays on guard. Trauma heightens this, making neutral situations feel dangerous. Research shows that relationships act as regulators of nervous system states. A soothing partner's tone can down-regulate arousal. A critical one can escalate it. Gottman's research on marriages revealed that physiological reactivity, heart rate, skin conductance during conflict predicted long-term relationship outcomes better than the words themselves. In other words, the nervous system tells the truth even when the mind denies it. Scenario and analysis. fear and security in context. Individual example, job interview anxiety. A person preparing for a job interview feels their heart race, palms sweat, and mind go blank. Objectively, no life threat exists. But the nervous system treats social evaluation as survival, rooted in our evolutionary dependence on groups. Studies on social evaluative threat, Dickerson and Kemeny, 2004, show cortisol spikes in such moment mirror those of physical danger. Relationship example, conflict escalation. In a couple's argument, one partner raises their voice slightly. The other, shaped by childhood exposure to shouting, perceives danger. Their body reacts with fight or flight. What could have been a small disagreement escalates into shouting or withdrawal. Gottman's Four Horsemen research shows that when physiological flooding occurs, rational dialogue becomes nearly impossible. The nervous system drives the conflict. Group example, the Stanford Prison Experiment in 1971. Philip Zimbardo's study showed how quickly ordinary individuals adopted roles of power and submission. Guards became abusive, prisoners became submissive. What this reveals is how group structures can hijack nervous system states. For the guards, authority activated aggression. For the prisoners, helplessness induced freeze and despair. Though ethically flawed, the study illustrates how fear and security cues in groups override personal morality. Historical example, Cold War fear culture. In the 1950s, the constant threat of nuclear war shaped daily life in the West. Children drilled in duck and cover routines carried nervous systems tuned to catastrophe. Sociologists argue that this produced a cultural baseline of anxiety, shaping politics, trust, and relationships for decades. Here we see how collective nervous system states ripple across generations. Integration moment, fear and anxiety are not random. They are the nervous system trying to protect us, sometimes too well. By naming our states and recognizing how they play out in daily life, from interviews to arguments to group dynamics, we loosen their grip. Fear doesn't disappear, but it becomes something we can work with rather than be ruled by. Seed to plant this week. When anxiety rises, pause and ask, what is my body trying to protect me from right now? Even if the fear feels irrational, acknowledge the body's wisdom. Safety begins with listening. Polarity, attraction, and choosing wrong partners. We like to believe attraction is rational, that we choose partners based on compatibility, shared values, or conscious intention. But in reality, much of attraction happens beneath awareness. The nervous system makes its move before the mind has time to reflect. The nervous system chooses before we do this, is why we sometimes find ourselves drawn to partners who are not good for us, or why we repeat patterns even when we know better. Polarity, the unconscious pull between opposites, often feels like chemistry, but it can be trauma calling to trauma. Attributes of the nervous system, attraction, familiarity, drawn to what echoes early attachment, even if unsafe. Polarity, opposites attract, not just in personality, but in nervous system regulation. Instability, cycles of passion and collapse mistaken for spark. Projection, seeing in the other what we lack or disown in ourselves. Repetition, unconscious patterns repeated until integrated. Themes, how trauma shapes attraction, the chemistry of familiar pain. People raised in chaotic or unsafe homes often feel drawn to partners who unconsciously replicate that chaos. It feels like home, not safe, but familiar. The trauma bond, cycles of intensity and rupture, can trigger dopamine and cortisol loops, making unhealthy relationships feel addictive. The polarity trap, attraction often mirrors nervous system opposites. Anxious partners pairing with avoidant ones, fighters pairing with freezers. The fit feels real but often perpetuates instability. Healing versus repetition. Unless we become conscious, we repeat. But when aware, those same patterns can become portals for healing. Personal reflection. Looking back, I can see how often my nervous system was choosing long before my mind caught up. In some relationships, I felt a magnetic pull from the very beginning. It was intense, consuming, impossible to ignore. At the time, I mistook that intensity for love. But in hindsight, I see it for what it was, familiarity. My body recognized the chaos, the insecurity, the inconsistency, not as warning signs, but as something it knew. It was a strange echo of my childhood, where emotional volatility was normal. One partner in particular stands out. The attraction was instant, almost electric. We'd swing between moments of closeness and sudden distance, passion and silence. My anxious pull only made her avoidance stronger, and the harder I tried, the more I lost myself. I can see now how my own nervous system fed the loop, chasing safety in someone who couldn't provide it, because what I really wanted wasn't her, but the healing of something unresolved in me. Those experiences taught me that chemistry isn't always a sign of rightness. Sometimes it's a sign of repetition. The nervous system seeks to complete the unfinished story, and unless we become conscious, we keep replaying it, mistaking intensity for intimacy. Psychological insight, attachment, polarity, and trauma repetition attachment research, Bowlby, Ainsworth, shows that early bonds shape later attraction. Anxious children often grow into anxious lovers. Avoidant children grow into avoidant adults. When these types meet, they create the anxious avoidant trap, a polarity of pursuit and distance that feels magnetic but rarely stable. Neuroscience explains why unhealthy bonds feel addictive. The trauma bond, cycles of tension, rupture, and reunion activate dopamine and oxytocin in ways similar to gambling. Like variable rewards in casinos, unpredictable affection creates compulsive attachment. Psychodynamic theory, Freud, later object relations thinkers, adds another lens. We are compelled to repeat unresolved dynamics until they are integrated. The partner we can't quit is often the one who mirrors an unfinished wound. Studies on polyvagal states reinforce this. People with hyperaroused systems often unconsciously seek avoidant partners who confirm their fear of abandonment, while shut down individuals may be drawn to fiery partners who jolt them awake. It's less about conscious choice, more about nervous systems seeking balance or replaying imbalance. Scenario and analysis. When attraction turns into repetition, individual example, the anxious avoidance cycle, an anxious partner texts repeatedly seeking reassurance. The avoidant partner withdraws, overwhelmed. The anxious partner interprets withdrawal as rejection, escalating pursuit. Both nervous systems reinforce the cycle, mistaking instability for intensity. Gottman's research shows these mismatches create chronic physiological flooding, making resolution nearly impossible without awareness. Relationship example, trauma bond in domestic abuse, a partner alternates between affection and cruelty. The victim clings harder after moments of abuse because the reunion triggers dopamine and oxytocin release. Lundy Bancroft's work on abusive relationships highlights how unpredictability keeps victims locked in, mistaking survival responses for devotion. Group example: charismatic leaders and devoted followers throughout history. Figures like Jim Jones or Hitler exploited polarity dynamics at scale. Followers projected unmet needs onto leaders who promised certainty. The intensity of belonging masked destructive consequences. Here, the nervous system's hunger for safety and polarity in group dynamics became a collective catastrophe. Integration moment attraction is not always a sign of alignment. Sometimes it's a sign of repetition. When we learn to pause and ask, is this chemistry or is this familiarity? We begin to see what is really happening. Recognizing nervous system polarity is not about avoiding attraction, but about deepening it into something that heals rather than repeats. Seed to plant this week: reflect on one past or present relationship where the chemistry felt overwhelming. Ask, was this connection nourishing or was it a repetition of something unresolved? Awareness is the first step toward choosing partners who bring safety, not just intensity. Practices for regulation and long-term healing. Trauma isn't just in the mind. It lives in the body, in the quickening heartbeat, the shallow breath, the frozen stillness when conflict arises. The body remembers, but it can also relearn, but the same body that remembers can also relearn. Healing the nervous system isn't about erasing the past. It's about teaching body safety again, so it doesn't keep mistaking love for threat or conflict for catastrophe. Attributes of nervous system healing: safety, creating conditions where the body can finally exhale. Awareness, noticing states before they spiral into reaction. Regulation, shifting from survival to presence. Connection, finding safe others who co-regulate. Integration, weaving past wounds into wisdom, not repetition. Themes: healing in practice, somatic awareness. Trauma lives in sensations before words. Practices like body scans or pendulation, somatic experiencing, Levine, teach us to notice subtle shifts and discharge stored tension. Regulation practices, breathwork, grounding exercises, or vagal toning help the body return from fight, flight, or freeze into balance. Safe relationships. Attachment research shows those that earn secure attachment can develop later in life through safe, consistent relationships that rewire old expectations. Boundaries and recalibration. Nervous systems heal when they learn to say no without fear and yes without collapse. Boundaries protect presence. Trauma integration, post-traumatic growth research, Tedeschi and Calhoun, 1996, shows that meaning-making, community, and self-reflection can transform pain into resilience. Personal reflection. When I think about nervous system healing, I see the long arc of my own journey. In my 20s, I often ignored my body completely. When migraines or diabetes symptoms surfaced later in life, I pushed through them, convinced I could outthink or outwork my limits. But the more I ignored it, the louder my body became. Each collapse was a signal, one I didn't yet know how to read. In relationships, too, my nervous system often ran the show. When I felt someone pulling away, anxiety flooded me. My mind told me to stay calm, but my body raced, heart pounding, chest tightening, thoughts spiraling. At the time, I didn't understand that this was my nervous system in survival mode, replaying old fears of abandonment. Slowly, I began to learn practices that helped. Breathwork in moments of panic, grounding by feeling my feet on the floor when my thoughts ran wild, choosing to pause before reacting. Later, I learned about co-regulation, how simply being in the presence of someone calm, safe, and attuned could ease my own system. That changed the way I sought connection, no longer chasing intensity, but choosing safety. It wasn't easy. There were setbacks, relapses into old patterns, moments where I mistook intensity for intimacy. But over time, I began to feel the difference. When my body was calm, relationships felt different. Conflict was still uncomfortable, but it no longer felt like life or death. I could breathe, and from that breath, I could choose differently. Psychological insight from survival to safety polyvagal theory, Porges 2011, explains this beautifully. The nervous system shifts between three main states: social engagement, safety, fight, flight, threat, and freeze, collapse. Trauma leaves many of us stuck oscillating between fight, flight, and freeze. Healing involves expanding the window of tolerance, the range in which we can feel safe and connected even under stress. Somatic therapies. Levine van der Kolk emphasized that trauma is not just what happened, but how the body holds it. Practices that release held tension, trembling, deep exhalation, and grounding allow the system to reset. Attachment research also highlights the role of co-regulation. Infants learn to self-soothe through caregivers' attunement. Adults can relearn this in safe relationships, creating earned security even after insecure beginnings. Studies on post-traumatic growth show that trauma does not have to end in deficit. With integration, survivors often report greater appreciation for life, deeper relationships, and stronger resilience. But this growth comes not from bypassing pain, but from entering it with awareness and support. For me, science makes sense from my lived experience. Those moments of collapse, panic, or dysregulation weren't failures of willpower. They were the nervous system doing its job, trying to protect me. Healing began when I stopped fighting those states and started listening to them, when I saw them not as enemies but as signals, scenarios and analysis, nervous system patterns in daily life. Individual example, panic in conflict. A person with a history of abandonment feels their partner go quiet during an argument. Their nervous system floods with fight-flight energy and they lash out or cling harder. Without awareness, the cycle repeats. With awareness, they can pause, ground, and name their fear rather than act from it. Relationship example, freeze in intimacy. A partner with a trauma history finds physical closeness overwhelming, not because of a lack of attraction, but because their body associates intimacy with danger. Without compassion, the other partner may take this personally. With education in nervous system states, both can reframe the moment as freeze and approach slowly with safety cues. Group example, the Stanford Prison Experiment, Zimbardo, 1971. When individuals were placed in roles of prisoner or guard, nervous system states escalated rapidly. Guards abused power. Prisoners collapsed into freeze and despair. The study revealed how quickly environments of authority and fear can dysregulate entire groups, producing destructive patterns that were not innate but situational. This shows how trauma and nervous system states are not just personal, they scale up in groups, institutions, and even nations. Integration moment healing the nervous system is not about becoming calm all the time. It's about learning to move flexibly between states without getting stuck. To know that fear will come, collapse will come, but safety can return. It's about rewriting the body's map from one shaped by trauma to one that can hold presence, intimacy, and trust. Seed to plant this week, practice one small act of nervous system awareness. When you feel stressed, ask yourself, am I in fight, flight, freeze, or safety? Then take one step toward regulation, a breath, a pause, a safe connection. Over time, these small acts become pathways back to wholeness. Reclaiming the nervous system, the body is not the enemy, it is the witness. Every panic, every collapse, every surge of anger or freeze of silence, these are not flaws in our character, but signals from a system doing its best to protect us. To heal is not to erase those signals, but to listen, to remember that fear and safety are not opposites, but states that we can move between. That love requires not only the heart, but a nervous system that trusts it won't be destroyed by closeness. We may never completely silence the echoes of trauma, but we can learn to regulate, to breathe, to rest, to seek out safe connections, and to return again and again to presence. Healing begins in the body, but it does not end there. It ripples outward into relationships, into families, into the culture we build together. You've been listening to The Unfiltered Human on the Fringe. Until next time, stay human, stay awake, and remember, the nervous system doesn't just carry our wounds, it carries our capacity to heal. James Miller. If you found value in today's episode, you may also be interested in my broader project, The Inversiverse, a series exploring the hidden architecture of perception, identity, control, and consciousness. Across 20 episodes, The Inversiverse dissects indoctrination, language, media manipulation, dark psychology, belief systems, and the evolution of self in the digital age. You can find all episodes of The Inversiverse on Facebook, YouTube, Rumble, and Substack by searching this place called Earth. These ideas aren't shared to convince you, but to invite you to think, feel, and perceive more consciously in a world designed to keep you distracted. Overview of the Inversiverse, a journey through the mirrors of mind, culture, and control. Episodes 1 to 3 introduce foundational ideas around indoctrination, perception, and manipulation. Episode 4 explores how language, symbols, and cultural norms are used to shape thought. Episode 5 investigates control systems, media narratives, and the illusion of choice. Episodes 6 to 7 dives into collective belief structures and the psychology of mass behavior. Episode 8 focuses on marketing, control theory, game theory, and critical thinking. Episode 9 covers love, relationships, human mating, gender dynamics, and red-blue pill ideologies. Episode 10 unpacks dark psychology, the occult, Satanism, and the dark tribe personality types. Episode 11 The Simulated Self examines identity, ego, and the rise of post-human consciousness. Episode 12 The Spell of the Mind inquires into language, illusion, and physiology of thought. Episode 13 Conscious Seduction journeys through persuasion, propaganda, and the unseen forces of the mind. Episode 14 The Myth of Sanity sheds light on madness, genius, and the edge of perception. Episode 15 The Algorithmic Mind probes influence, identity, and invisible architects. Episode 16 The Noise of Knowing reveals overload, obsession, and the age of infinite information. Episode 17 Belief Machines delves further into language, desire, and the engine of reality. Episode 18 Submerged Signals examines how the unseen shapes the self. Episode 19 The Alchemy Within traces food, frequency, and the forgotten intelligence of the body. Episode 20 Encoded Flesh scrutinizes and opens up to the forgotten language of the body, DNA, and biological consciousness.